The beginning of Russia's conservative turn was also partially spurred by the political crisis during the re-election of Vladimir Putin in 2012, for his third presidential term, where the ruling United Russia Party found itself in need of a new solid ideological foundation for its self-legitimation. During this time, there were mass protests in Moscow and other cities, triggered by growing dissatisfaction with the undemocratic political system that did not meet their economic needs. To maintain power, it became necessary for the United Russia Party to find a new political language that would rebrand the regime's purpose and reshape social discourse in a way that diverts attention away from economic issues. The persistence of this dilemma points to the ideological hollowness of the post-Soviet system, its inability to fill the void of political purpose since communism's collapse. So after returning to office in 2012, Putin adopted more stridently nationalistic rhetoric. The Putin regime started promoting a new official ideology, which placed ever greater emphasis on civilizational differences between the East and West. But this new moral anti-Americanism attacked liberalism and individualism from a conservative position. From the standpoint of this conservative worldview, the West is losing its authentic foundations: Christianity, the traditional family, and national unity. According to purveyors of this ideology, the threat of decadence in Russia comes not from the Russian elite's excessive desire for luxury. No, the danger comes from elsewhere, from homosexuality, feminism, and multiculturalism, which are supposedly destroying the traditional family and threatening Russian civilization. These ideological frames were used as a strategy for dealing with dissent at home. Putin's opponents and those criticizing the government were smeared as traitors or agents of Western agendas. Putin blamed the 2011 to 2012 Russian protests on the US State Department, describing the protests as an attempt at quote-unquote color revolution, a term that is usually invoked by leftists to describe protests that are helped by the USA in order to destabilize governments. And while the USA certainly does have a history of sponsoring protests to destabilize countries that do not bow down to Washington's demands, the evidence clearly suggests that Russians in 2011 to 2012 had many genuine reasons to protest. During the economic growth of the mid-2000s, peaking at around 2007, Russian capitalism was finally starting to deliver improvements in living standards for everyday Russians. But all that came to an end during the 2008 global financial crash. And throughout the 2010s, the Russian economy was in a dire state. Arguably, they still haven't recovered from it to this day. With a stagnant economy, growing austerity, creeping state repression, and the erasure of social benefits from the Soviet era, Russians had and still have every right to want to protest and express their dissent. The government's subsequent crackdown on the protest movement was justified by the Putin regime using culture war terminology, framing the protests as agents of chaos, incited by a minority of pro-Western traitors to the motherland, defying the silent majority of Russian patriots who stand for order, tradition, and orthodox values. A similar tactic of turning political protests into culture wars can be seen during the famous persecution of the music group called Pussy Riot. The famous Pussy Riot performance at a Moscow cathedral, which was supposed to be feminist and anti-authoritarian, was depicted by state media as part of a decadent liberal ideological war, directed against sacred Russian traditional values. The arrest, trial, and incarceration of Pussy Riot was followed by the onset of a homophobic campaign in the state media that attempted to frame the anti-government protest movement as part of a broader culture war, covertly backed by the West. Although in response, Putin's homophobic stances were actually mocked by protesters and turned into a viral meme. Conservative culture wars in Russia specifically targeted gender politics, as LGBT rights were presented in the Russian media as a dividing line between Western decadence and a traditional Russian normality. Does this sound a bit like the culture war nonsense that conservatives whine about in the USA, Britain, and other Western countries? Well, that's because it is. Culture wars distract people from class wars. Pitting identity groups against each other and making a spectacle out of it is a typical divide-and-conquer strategy of social control, which distracts people from real problems like poverty, economic inequality, and climate change. Culture war conservatives like Tucker Carlson and Jordan Peterson would absolutely love Putin's Russia. Maybe they should move there. In fact, conservative ideologists like Pat Buchanan, key pioneer of the American far right and author of the book The Death of the West, greatly admire Putin's Russia for fighting against what he and other reactionaries call cultural Marxism. We've certainly heard that a lot before from right-wingers in the West. Putin himself also has a history of backing far-right politicians. For instance, Putin supported far-right candidates in France, Italy, Germany, Austria, and Hungary, just to name a few. And yes, despite the liberal hysteria regarding the Russiagate hoax trial, it is well documented that Putin tried his best to get Donald Trump elected in the 2016 election, by spreading far-right propaganda on the internet even though he didn't actually rig the election. And as we explored in the last video, the Americans have a history of rigging elections themselves, in Boris Yeltsin's 1996 election. But contrary to American conservatism, which is still steeped in liberal individualism, Russian conservatism is rebranded as collectivist, giving it a more communitarian appeal. Even though Putin is vocally anti-communist, this conservative collectivism still resonates with a lot of people because it taps into the nostalgia for the lost collective spirit of the Soviet era, as well as the natural human inclination for a sense of community. A key component of this conservative ideology promoted in Kremlin propaganda has been emphasizing the dichotomy between Russian collectivism and Western individualism, a Cold War-era trope, except this time it is framed as conservatism versus liberalism instead of communism versus capitalism. Here, Russian collectivism is presented as prioritizing common interests over personal interests, in contrast to Western egoism, which is perceived to be decadent and a result of declining traditional moral values. However, while touting this conservative rhetoric, which included attacks on Western free market individualism, the Russian elite ironically continued to pursue corporatist neoliberal economic policies, as shown in our previous video on the nature of Putin's regime. The Kremlin's rebranded conservative collectivism seeks to reclaim and preserve Russia's traditional Christian heritage. In doing so, Russia is presented as the guardian of so-called universal traditional values against liberal materialism in a civilizational culture war between the East and West. Since the 2010s, Putin has become increasingly close to the anti-communist leader of the Russian Orthodox Church, named Patriarch Kirill. Sorry if I'm butchering that. As part of his conservative agenda, Putin has helped revitalize the influence of the Russian Orthodox Church in Russian society. In doing so, they have also helped whitewash the legacy of the Tsarist Empire. This conservative rhetoric would coincide with a political movement called Eurasianism. In recent years, there has been a lot of talk in the Western media about an ideologist named Alexander Dugin, and his popularization of a concept called Eurasianism. Dugin is a very bizarre right-wing thinker who many claim is a chief ideologist for Vladimir Putin. Some have even compared him to Rasputin. You know, the guy who was allegedly influencing the Tsar's policies. Eurasianism could broadly be described as a conservative anti-liberal ideology that sees Russian civilization not belonging to Europe or Asia, but instead to the geopolitical concept of Eurasia. Dugin's vision of Eurasianism, at least purportedly, is that of a Russian-led Eurasian empire that would challenge Western hegemony and American exceptionalism. From this viewpoint, the USA and the West are on the decline, and we are entering a multipolar world, whereby China and Russia are resurging powers challenging the US world order. Interestingly, what proponents of Eurasianism dislike about the West is not capitalism, but social liberalism. Originally, a far larger section of this video was going to be dedicated to Alexander Dugin, but after extensive research, I found that the actual influence of Alexander Dugin in Russia itself is greatly exaggerated. He's barely talked about at all in Russia, and talked about far more in Western media. In reality, Eurasianism is not widely known or popular enough to become a mass ideology in Russia. Its reach is mostly confined to niche right-wing intellectual circles, and the stated ambitions of Eurasianism and Alexander Dugin are really detached from reality, and greatly overestimate Russia's power in the world, which is essentially bound to the demand for Russian petrol. If Europe is to transition to clean energy, it is likely that Russian geopolitical influence will greatly diminish, which is another reason why Putin backs far-right candidates, who deny climate change. It is in the interests of many in the Russian elite to actually allow climate change to get far worse. Despite its massive nuclear arsenal, Russia is really not that powerful economically speaking. Russia's economy is barely bigger than that of Italy, and is smaller than the state of Texas. So if there was a geopolitical power rising to challenge the US, it wouldn't be Russia. If anyone, it would be China. If anything, Dugin's Eurasianism mainly serves as a more exaggerated, delusional grand narrative to further justify the existence of the Putin regime among the Russian intelligentsia, and to win the support of opponents of liberalism around the world. But most everyday Russians aren't reading Dugin's obscure books on philosophy and geopolitics. Now, whether Putin himself seriously believes in Eurasianist ideology, or abides by any real ideological principles for that matter, is up for question. But given how insignificant Eurasianism actually is among the Russian masses, we shouldn't spend too much time fixating on it. That being said, Eurasianism does resemble an exaggerated version of the collectivist populist ethos that Putin has been trying to brand himself with. One of Eurasianism's supposed goals is combating US hegemony, and part of the Russian state media's propaganda has been to brand the Kremlin's actions as anti-imperialist. This framing is a convenient way to differentiate Russia's capitalism from Western capitalism, and to further distract people at home from class struggle. Because Russia appears to be trying to undermine US hegemony, many people who rightly despise all of the terrible things that the US empire has done tend to mistakenly view Russia as an anti-imperialist force. After all, many people remember the Soviet Union's efforts in aiding the anti-imperialist liberations of Cuba, Algeria, Angola, Egypt, and more. The USSR actually lost money aiding these efforts. But suffice to say that Russia today is not the Soviet Union. Russia today is an imperialist power, albeit on a much smaller scale than the USA. Although the recent invasion of Ukraine may make Russia's imperialist status seem obvious, imperialism is not limited to invasions. In fact, most imperialism doesn't require invasions at all. For Marxists, imperialism is the domination of one country's corporations over another country's natural resources and labor. Imperialism is often exerted indirectly, through trade deals, political corruption, and diplomatic relations maintained with the threat of internal military coups, assassinations, and sanctions. Russia fits all the criteria that Marxists use to define imperialism. If you want to learn more about exactly why Russia is imperialist, I highly recommend checking out this video by Marxist Paul on the screen, once you're done watching this video. Despite being on a far smaller scale than American imperialism, Russia pursues imperialist interests in countries such as Kazakhstan, Georgia, Moldova, the Ukraine, Syria, and more. In addition to national security concerns, another reason why Russia is terrified of Ukraine joining NATO and is invading them in response is because Ukraine has a lot of oil and gas. Europe staying dependent on Russian petrol is a key part of Russian geopolitical power. And if Ukraine is governed by pro-NATO forces, Western companies could take control of Ukraine's oil and gas reserves, and Russia could lose a lot of economic power. Sadly, Ukraine is a highly corrupt state caught between different imperialist powers. It's also important to remember that Russia overtly allies itself with imperialist countries. In fact, Russia has been one of Israel's closest allies and backs their apartheid settler colonialism. However, Putin does a clever job at justifying the Kremlin's foreign policy, shambolic democracy, and authoritarian practices by calling out the blatant hypocrisy of the United States when it comes to their own authoritarianism, imperialism, and lack of democracy. Indeed, Putin plays off US hypocrisy to often justify the Kremlin's actions by using liberal interventionist logic against itself. The reincorporation of Crimea in 2014 and the recent special military operation in Ukraine were justified by the need to prevent the Ukrainian genocide of the Russian-speaking population, using a similar logic that the United States employed to justify their military intervention in Yugoslavia, to supposedly prevent a genocide in Kosovo. In the course of its worsening relations with the USA, the tone of Russian diplomacy has become ever more ironic and includes elements of parody, as they mockingly copy the USA's playbook knowing full well that the USA is in no position to morally condemn them. In the same way that American propaganda fixates on China and Russia's sins in order to distract their citizens from their own country's problems, Russian media also exposes US hypocrisy and the horrors of US imperialism in an effort to divert Russian citizens from challenging their own government. But still, conservative culture war ideology and state propaganda are not enough to prevent people from rebelling against the system. There are even more clever forms of soft power, such as inciting confusion and killing hope. A core part of the current Russian regime's strategy of control is confusion, intentionally putting out contradictory messages to blur the lines between what is real and what is not. This form of control in Russia was described very well in Adam Curtis's documentary titled Hypernormalization, where he depicted Putin's former chief propagandist, Vladislav Surkov. Throughout the 2000s up until 2020, Surkov was viewed as one of the most influential propagandists and ideologists of the Putin administration. He had a background in theater, and he brought his talents in theater and the arts to help the Kremlin develop a form of propaganda that was far more effective than previous forms of propaganda. Here's a clip from the documentary about how Surkov aided the propaganda of the Putin regime. Instead of merely promoting pro-state messages on TV and trying to convince citizens of a certain truth, Surkov showed the Kremlin how they could instead get citizens to doubt their very conception of truth itself, so that they could never really differentiate what is true from what is false. Instead of solely manufacturing support for the regime and smearing enemies of Putin, constantly confusing the public with contradictory messages would render them unable to challenge the regime in the first place. To go further, what is even more effective than telling people that the system is simply fine or diverting people's attention away from its problems is crushing people's very hope, creating a crippling sense of capitalist realism, the cynical view that there is no alternative to the current system, and that any attempt to resist it will be futile. I would argue that cynicism is a crucial part of social control in modern-day Russia. Due to feeling understandably hopeless about their current situation, many Russians feel nostalgia for the past, nostalgia for the Soviet Union, and Putin knows how to pay lip service to this nostalgia. But do Putin and the Kremlin elite really want to restore the Soviet Union? Is this the underlying reason why he launched his special military operation in Ukraine, as many people claim? Whoever does not miss the Soviet Union has no heart. Whoever wants to bring it back has no brain. Vladimir Putin. In light of Russia's recent invasion over Ukraine, there has been a widespread narrative that Putin aims to restore the Soviet Union. This has been perpetuated over and over in the Western media. As we explored in the previous video on the nature of Putin's regime, Putin ain't no communist. But Putin's ambiguous statements about the USSR often lead to a lot of confusion. And by cherry-picking certain quotes of his, it is easy for the media to make it seem as though Putin wants to bring back the USSR, and that he is nostalgic for it. And some empty-headed media outlets have even gone as far to call Putin a Marxist-Leninist. Putin has famously spoken of the fall of the USSR as a geopolitical catastrophe. Along with many other Russians of his generation, he seemed to have felt the sense of national humiliation that the Soviet collapse brought. But Putin saying this is by no means his endorsement of Soviet communism. The fact that the fall of the USSR was a humanitarian catastrophe is an undeniable reality to anyone who knows the slightest bit about the history. During this event, people who lived in the former Soviet republics experienced a decline in living standards even greater than the Great Depression. Yes, the Great Depression of 1929. It was worse than that. GDP declined by more than half. Hyperinflation accelerated after price controls were removed. Unemployment soared after the job guarantees of the Soviet Union were abolished. And as a result, crime rose drastically. Overall, a horrible situation. So when Putin said whoever does not miss the Soviet Union has no heart and whoever wants to bring it back has no brain, he was indeed paying lip service to the widespread Soviet nostalgia that exists in Russia. At the same time, he's clearly also signaling that communism is a dead dream of the past. Putin even helped fund museums and monuments for the victims of Soviet repression, and has repeatedly supported anti-communist propaganda. Although Joseph Stalin surprisingly remains a relatively popular figure in Russia to this day, especially among the elderly, Putin still condemns Stalin's Red Terror in a speech he did at a memorial for Soviet repression. Putin has also criticized Vladimir Lenin, from a standpoint that is more favorable to the Tsarist Russian Empire. For example, Putin frequently criticizes Lenin as a bad leader for giving up territory of the former Russian Empire, and allowing Ukrainians, Kazakhs, and other peoples to have their own country, which Putin saw as a time bomb that would inevitably hurt Russian interests. In a speech trying to justify his recent invasion of Ukraine, Putin even blamed Lenin for quote-unquote creating the Ukraine, saying, quote, "Ukraine is the result of the Bolsheviks' policy, and can rightly be called Vladimir Lenin's Ukraine. He was its creator and architect." Okay, we get it. Putin doesn't want to rebuild the Soviet Union. But does Putin want to rebuild the Russian Empire? Does Putin want to colonize Ukraine? There is little evidence to suggest that the Kremlin plans to completely take over all of the Ukraine. The evidence actually suggests that an invasion was not part of their Plan A in the first place, as it would have a huge backlash economically and politically, as we're seeing right now. In fact, the president of the Ukraine himself didn't even expect an invasion, and firmly maintained that an invasion was unlikely despite Washington sending out warnings. The invasion of Ukraine has already been catastrophic for the Russian economy, and the war is extremely unpopular with both Ukrainians and Russians. Needless to say, Ukrainians have had it the worst. The invasion has not been going according to plan. Well, maybe because it wasn't ever really part of the plan. In addition, it would be very difficult for Russia to successfully take over all of Ukraine, and it would be impossible to maintain it. It would be extremely costly, and they would face resistance for a very long time, probably forever. Does Putin secretly want to restore the Russian Empire? Maybe. He probably does. He probably does fantasize about it, but that doesn't mean he will or can, as it would be impossible even if they wanted to do so. Now I would like to thank all my patrons, especially these generous people. One Dime is an entirely fan-funded project. Lots of in-depth research goes into these videos compared to much of the depthless political analysis out there on YouTube and the media. So if you want to help support the work I do on the One Dime channel and the One Dime Radio podcast, then consider becoming a patron. And be sure to hit that notification bell so you get notified when I upload the next video.